Hello, I'm back. I'm going to read the next topic in Chapter 7, which is entitled Restless Decade. The next topic is called Peace of Sorts, and I'm just going to bring in some pictures to show you. First, I will read this. I know it just gives us a brief overview. Following World War I, King George focused on navigating the changing political landscape of the British Empire and fostering unity amid social and political shifts. He played a key role in the transition from the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the House of Windsor, and the Statute of Westminster in 1931 recognized the independence of British dominions. He also addressed social issues that were formed a national government during the economic crisis and initiated an annual royal Christmas broadcast. So, yeah, we see some pictures of him doing the broadcast, very similar to Franklin Delano Roosevelt doing the broadcast. He initiated the Christmas broadcast, the one Queen Elizabeth is famous for, and the one her father would do also, and he suffered with that stutter. So I had a picture in here of him doing the broadcast. But King George V had quite a bit of different ordeals to deal with when he assumed the monarchy. There he is. See, here's King George right there doing the broadcast, and of course his son, King George VI. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And this is a good chapter entitled Peace of Sorts. How are the mighty fallen, wrote the king on hearing that Kaiser had abdicated. His diary continues. He has been the emperor for just over 30 years. He did great things for his country, but his ambition was too great. He wished to dominate the world and create his military machine for that object. No man can dominate the world. It's been tried before, and now he has utterly ruined his country and himself. I look upon him as the greatest criminal known for having plunged the world into this ghastly war, which has lasted over 4 years and 3 months with all its mystery. The magnanimity which the king had tried to preserve throughout the war gave way to a revulsion from all things German. In all my life, he told Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the future president of the United States, I have never seen a German gentleman. A few weeks later, after the armistice, his son Prince Albert, by now serving with the Royal Air Forces in Germany, met the Kaiser's sister, Princess Victoria. He wrote to his father, She asked after you and the family and hoped that we should be friendly again. I told her politely I did not think it was possible for a great many years. The king replied, Your answer to Cousin Nicky, who of course I have known all my life, was quite correct. The sooner she knows the real feeling of bitterness which exists here against her country, the better. In October 1920, when obliged to receive the first post-war ambassador from Germany, he noted it was more than 6 years since he had shaken hands with a German. Not until 1935 could he write to a German cousin. the Grand Duke of Hesse. That horrible and unnecessary war has made no difference to my feelings for you. So, Ernest Cassel, King Edward VII's intimate friend and financial advisor, was among those to experience a chill of disfavor that lasted until his death in 1921. Although he had emigrated from Germany at an early age and displayed what in 1916 was Mrs. Winston Churchill called his red-hot patriotism, neither he nor even his money was acceptable to war-scarred English society. When the Marlborough Club ran heavily into debt, Cassel offered to meet the entire deficit, but its members refused to be rescued by a one-time alien. Instead, they turned to King George V, son of the club's founder, who produced the necessary £7,000. Whether from pride or insensitivity, Cassel courted further humiliation in 1919 by attending a service for the Order of St. Michael and St. George, of which he had been appointed a Knight Grand Cross 14 years earlier. Another friend of King Edward's, the Marquis de Severell, was angry at having to walk with Cassel in the procession. And Lord Lincolnshire, he turned his back on him. Cassel died only a few months before an event that would surely have erased the bitter memory of such slights: the marriage of his granddaughter Edwina to Lord Louis Mountbatten. Even Albert Mensdorff, the king's cousin and former Austrian ambassador, did not feel able to return to England until 1924, 10 years after his reluctant departure for Vienna. During the war, he was rumored to have spoken insultingly about Britain, but being an Austrian, not a German, was given the benefit of every doubt. Lord Crewe asked what he would do if he chanced to meet Mensdorff again, and replied, "First I would shake hands with him, because he's an old friend. Then I might ask him about an unpleasant report that had appeared in the newspaper, and about which he could no doubt offer some satisfactory explanation." The king was more cautious in his welcome. On Mensdorff's first reappearance, he was invited to tea at the palace, but the occasion was not recorded in the court circular. In 1925, it was announced that the former ambassador had been to lunch. In 1926, Mensdorff again had tea with the king and queen, but noted in his diary, "There is nevertheless a certain carefulness. For example, I was not asked to come to Sandringham, which they would previously have done." In 1927, he returned to Sandringham for the first time since before the war, and he was told by the king to wear once more his Royal Victorian Order. Thereafter, the visit became an annual event in Mensdorff's calendar. His lot may be contrasted with that of Count Metternich, the German ambassador in London until 2 years before the war. In 1923, he lunched with Asquith, and he wrote, "He's a tragic figure. Everything he had invested here under Sir E. Castle's advice, and the utmost that so far he's been able to recover from the wreckage is £200. When I asked him after lunch whether I should call a taxi, he replied, no, that he always went now by bus." Another of the king's cousins waited in vain for a friendly word from Buckingham Palace, the Kaiser, who before the war had been much criticized for the Englishness of his ideas. His habits, and even his clothes, resented this silence. Yet the king's stern condemnation of November 1918 was tempered by pity. He was not a man to kick a fallen enemy. It infuriated the king to hear that the wife of the British minister to Holland had jeered at the Kaiser as he arrived from Germany to begin his exile. A few months later, her husband was prematurely retired from diplomatic service. Lloyd George's proposal to have the Kaiser extradited from Holland and put on trial for war crimes also incensed the king, particularly as he learned of it through the newspaper. It moved him, Hankey noted, to a violent tirade, on and off for half an hour. The king warned the prime minister that to parade the Kaiser through the streets of London would provoke disorder. Lloyd George's response seemed to recall an earlier age of justice. The state prisoner would be lodged at Sion, the Duke of Northumberland's house on the Thames, and brought down the river each day to stand trial at Westminster Hall. An alternative plan was to try the Kaiser in the ancient royal palace of Hampton Court, on the outskirts of London. That would have meant evicting all the courtiers, widows, and old ladies from the apartments which they occupied by grace and favor of successive sovereigns. To the king's relief, the Dutch government refused all requests for extradition. The ex-Kaiser settled down at Doorn as an industrious, enterprising rather than vain country gentleman. His long exile, consoled by the novels of P.G. Wodehouse and cups of properly brewed English tea, the king never again met or corresponded with his cousin, who was hurt at receiving no word of condolence from England on the death of his first wife in 1921. Yet an ultimate reconciliation did take place. In January 1936, hearing that King George V lay dying at Sandringham, the former emperor telegraphed his sympathy to the Queen. Queen Mary responded with a grateful message of accompaniment by a present. It was not quite their last exchange. In October 1938, the Kaiser wrote to the widowed Queen Mary for the first time since 1914, congratulating her on the Munich Agreement, which both supposed would avert a Second World War. He signed the letter, "Your affectionate cousin, William." Queen Mary was much moved by the restoration of a family link at such a time of emotion. She sent it to her son, King George VI, to be preserved in the royal archives. Lloyd George's failure to consult the king about the proposed trial of the Kaiser, it was perhaps the most wounding, but not the most momentous of their post-war clashes. That began 6 days before the armistice, when peace was already assured. The Prime Minister demanded an early general election, from which the king tried to dissuade him. The arguments for and against such a course were nearly balanced. The king cited the precedent of the so-called khaki election of 1900, which had renewed the Unionist lease of power for 5 years, but had then provoked such a reaction as to keep them out of office ever since. That was a long-term risk which Lloyd George was prepared to take. He told the king that in 1900, Parliament had been in session for only 5 years of its 70-year span, whereas in November 1918, emergency legislation had already extended by 3 years its statutory life limited to 5 years since the Parliament Act of 1911. Fortified by its apparent concern for the restoration of democracy, Lloyd George had his way. He appealed to the country to allow the coalition government, which had won the war, to safeguard the peace. The country responded by giving him 526 of the 707 seats in the Commons, and at the same time almost extinguishing the independent Liberals led by Asquith, who was himself defeated in the Scottish constituency he had held for 32 years. Even before the new Parliament met in February 1919, the King and his Prime Minister had once before begun to spar. In December 1918, the government invited President Wilson to pay a state visit to England that was to begin on the day after Christmas. Stamfordham protested that the king was surprised and hurt at not being consulted about the arrangements, and that he proposed a plan that would interfere with his much-needed and well-earned holiday at Sandringham. Lloyd George brusquely replied, and the king's objections had been put to the Imperial War Cabinet, and that the Imperial War Cabinet had overruled the king. Gotta plug in my laptop. It's running out of battery juice. There we go. So I lost my place. So the sovereign dutifully remained at Buckingham Palace to greet the president and to hold a state banquet in his honor. Wilson made a deplorable impression. In reply to the toast of his health, he omitted any reference to the part played or the sacrifices endured by the British Empire in their joint struggle. Not a word of appreciation, let alone gratitude, came from his lips. Well, that's quite interesting to know. Lloyd George wrote, "The king was equally disenchanted. I could not bear him," he told a friend, "an entirely cold academic professor, an odious man. Only the Sandringham pheasants rejoiced." So King George was not too fond of Woodrow Wilson. Based on reading that, I don't blame him. The reconstruction of the coalition government after the election brought few surprises to a king who disliked change. Of its 77 members, all but 10 had served in the previous administration. Balfour remained for a few months at the Foreign Office before handing over to Curzon, and in turn replacing him as Lord President of the Council. At the Treasury, Austen Chamberlain succeeded Bonar Law, who was content to combine the leadership of the Commons with the sinecure office of Lord of the Privy Seal. Lloyd George's dependence on his support and counsel needed no outward display of power. Churchill became the Secretary of State for both war and air. There was one appointment, however, which the king at first resisted: the promotion of Sir Frederick Smith, the Attorney General, to become the Lord Chancellor, and in ancient parlance, keeper of the king's conscience. Stamfordham wrote to the Prime Minister assuring him that the king appreciated the difficulties of forming a government, and he did not want to add to them. By taking into consideration Sir Frederick's age, 47, that he was only the Attorney General for between 3 and 4 years. His Majesty fears the appointment will come as somewhat of a surprise to the legal profession. The king knows that his career both at the bar and in Parliament has been very successful, but His Majesty does not feel sure that Sir Frederick has established such a reputation in men's minds as to ensure that the country will welcome him to the second highest post which can be occupied by a subject of the crown. His Majesty, however, only hopes that he may be wrong in this forecast. Lloyd George replied that many distinguished Lord Chancellors had attained the office between the ages of 30 and 40. The king gave way, and F.E., as Smith was known to the world of politics, took his seat on the woolsack of Lord Birkenhead. Both Sandfordham and the Prime Minister, as it happens, had gone astray in their arithmetic. Smith was not 47, but 46, and only the notorious Judge Jeffreys, appointed Lord Chancellor in 1685, when 37, had been younger than Smith at the time of his elevation. Birkenhead proved more than worthy of his office. Both as Speaker of the House of Lords and as head of the judiciary, he embodied wisdom. Learning and energy. He had learning and energy in a dignified presence. He abhorred the tempering of justice with levity, and when sitting as Lord of Appeal, he prided himself that no observation of his was ever followed by the reporter's phrase, laughter in court. But when he put aside the trappings of state, conviviality reinserted itself. Owen Morshead, the king's librarian, liked to recall an evening at Sandringham when the king beckoned Birkenhead to sit on the side of him. Lord Hailsham, on the other hand, "I wish it would never end," he wrote, and he began to think it never would. There was a less decorous occasion on board the royal yacht Britannia at Cowes, when Birkenhead, having dined well, puffed a huge cigar in the Queen's face until a courtier tactfully persuaded him to go up on deck to see the stars. The pastime bored him, so he made his way below again, and he went into one of the ladies' cabins and said, "Hello, my little birdie, what a pretty little nest you have got." The Lord Chancellor could also display an ill temper which did not spare his sovereign. As when the king, outraged by a newspaper photograph of Birkenhead at No. 10 Downing Street in an old grey suit and a slouch hat, had told Sandfordham to rebuke such informality, the culprit replied, "I'm almost invariably to wear a silk hat, though very many of my colleagues who have not received remonstrances never do. On the morning in question I came from the country where I had no silk hat, and my train did not arrive in time to enable me to go home before the conference. I will not, I think, be suggested that it will have been proper to arrive at the conference in order to make good the defect in my equipment. The measure of my shortcoming, therefore, is that I did not remember to take a silk hat with me when I left London 3 days earlier. Inasmuch as this circumstance has caused annoyance to the king, I regret it, and in deference to his expressed views, frequently wear a style of hat which I have the misfortune to detest. We must hope that I shall be able to avoid such lapses in the future." And after all, in days far more formal than ours, it was never the custom to appraise the adequacy or dignity of Lord Chancellors in terms of their headgear. "I consider this a very rude letter," wrote the king, and it was left to Stamfordham to patch up the peace. There was a similar exchange a few years later when Stamfordham suggested that Birkenhead he ought to ask the king's permission before going abroad. His Majesty has noticed of late that his ministers leave the country without asking to leave to do so. It is a good old custom which the king hopes will be adhered to. Of course, His Majesty does not expect to be asked when ministers go over to Paris for a few days. Instead of humoring the king, Birkenhead, he bombarded Stamfordham with constitutional precedents for coming and going as he pleased. And in petulant vein he concluded, "You will assure the king, with my deep respect, that if he would wish to be consulted as to my brief absences, after several months of arduous and unbroken labor, I should of course consider it my duty to take His Majesty's pleasure." The king had known outspoken extroverts in the navy or in shooting parties, and his occasional conclusion with Birkenhead, whose merits as the Lord Chancellor he soon came to appreciate, left no bad blood. The Prime Minister was a more persistent cause of pain and worry, generally through thoughtfulness and neglect rather than a determination to be unpleasant. He knew, for instance, how annoyed the king had been at having Lord Beaverbrook thrust on him as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a minister responsible in part for the sovereign's private finances. Yet during the post-war government, Lloyd George repeated his blunder by appointing Sir William Sutherland to the post. Stamfordham gave the king's formal approval, but added that His Majesty would have hardly thought him suitable for the office in question. Few had a good word for him. My traveling companion in the car was an odious fellow called Sutherland. Hankey had written during the war, some sort of political parasite of LG's. He was known to fix the press on his master's behalf, and reputed the hawk of baronetcies at the clubs. Both the king and his duchy deserved a less compromised chancellor. Even at Buckingham Palace, the king was sometimes no better informed than any other newspaper reader about government business. At Balmoral, he felt very isolated, more or less cut off from official sources. Partly it was his own fault. On resuming his annual Scottish holiday in 1919, he at first dispensed with a minister in attendance. The ostensible reason was to relieve members of an overworked cabinet from additional duty. But it is also likely that he did not trust Lloyd George to send him congenial colleagues who would fit easily into the family circle. In the absence of the traditional link between Balmoral and Whitehall, it fell to the Prime Minister's staff to keep the king abreast of current problems. And this they failed to do. Bonar Law's private secretary, touring the Highlands with his wife one summer, had telephoned Balmoral to ask whether there was any news of the railway strike, which for several days had paralyzed the country. "Not a word," Stamfordham replied. "I have sent telegram after telegram from the king, and I have not had a single reply." It may be wondered why Stamfordham had not simply lifted the telephone and asked for a call to be connected to number 10 Downing Street. The reason lay not in any lack of equipment, but in the reluctance of the king and court to use it. As early as 1883, a telephone line was installed between Balmoral and the post office at Ballatar. so that telegrams could be sent and received with speed. In 1908, the castle acquired a complete telephone service linked to the Aberdeen Exchange, and so on to London. By 1896, Windsor could speak to Buckingham Palace and the Marlborough House, and to this day, Buckingham Palace retains its original subscriber number of 4832. Although the name of its exchange is Victoria, it has become an impersonal 930. Sandringham, too, acquired an early telephone, but a letter written from there in 1906 by Sir Dighton Probyn reveals impatience at its intrusion. Let me take my stylo and write quickly for the next quarter of an hour, as I have at that time before the post goes, if not interrupted. Bother it, the telephone went and has delayed me 5 minutes. The king, it is true, liked the telephone as a means of gossip. He would delight in telling the by now celebrated story of how each morning at 9:30 he would ring up his sister, Princess Victoria, for a chat. Of course, he would explain, we are not always too polite. One day her telephone bell rang at the usual time, and she took up the receiver and said, "Hallo, you old fool!" And the voice of the operator broke in, "Beg your pardon? Your Royal Highness, His Majesty is not yet on the line." But the king avoided the instrument for serious business, and the Lord Chamberlain was so astonished at receiving a call from him one morning that he noted it in his diary. Ministers shared his mistrust of the telephone, largely because every call in those days had to be connected by an operator who might overhear their secrets. Well, that's interesting. Not even Downing Street manned its telephones day and night. Lloyd George, dining at Haldane's house in 1919, found he had forgotten a paper he wanted to discuss, so he asked the butler to telephone number 10 for it. There was no reply. Clement Attlee has recorded how, until the advent of Churchill in 1940, there was no private line between Downing Street and the Chequers, the Prime Minister's country house. Just a single telephone in the butler's pantry. Even Godfrey Dawson, editor of the Times from 1912 to 1919 again, from 1923 to 1941, had no telephone in his house at Yorkshire throughout the first term and for the first 12 years of the second. When he wanted to speak to his office in London, he would walk a mile to the nearest post office. It was scarcely surprising that in 1919, Balmoral relied upon telegrams from the Prime Minister rather than resort to telephones. Lloyd George's neglect, it wounded the king's pride. It provoked Stamfordham to anger. Miss Stevenson, Lloyd George's confidant, urged him to be more considerate. "I told him that he does not pay the king very much attention," she wrote in her diary. "He gets out of going to the palace if he can, and he constantly refuses invitation to Windsor. He cannot be surprised if the king is a little hurt." The Prime Minister's discourtesy infected his staff, particularly Sutherland and the J.T. Davies, who did not trouble to rise their feet when the king's private secretary entered their room. A less churlish official was shocked one day to discover Stamfordham sitting patiently in the hall of number 10 on a wooden chair, as if in railway waiting rooms. Stamfordham, who even among his colleagues at the palace could be peppery, alarming and critical. He took his revenge by letting no lapse on the part of Downing Street pass unnoticed or unrebuked. He spoke bitterly to Hankey of the Prime Minister's absence from the Commons when a message from the King was being read. Hankey explained that he had been ill. Stanfordham replied, "Well, I suppose one suspects Lloyd George of things which one would not suspect in another man." The King displayed a more forgiving disposition. While staying with Lord Derby at Knowles in 1921, he heard that Lloyd George was in a low spirits after Bonar Law had obliged by ill health to retire from government. He at once wrote a letter of friendly encouragement, addressed to Stanfordham in London, but really for the eyes of a despondent Prime Minister. It included one of these warming sentiments: "I firmly believe that LG is now more necessary to his country than he has ever been, and that the vast majority of the people are behind him. You can tell the Prime Minister that I have complete confidence in him and will do everything in my power to help him. There really ought to be two Prime Ministers. No one can do the work LG has to do. I quite understand his feeling lonely and almost lost without BL, who did so much for him. I was talking to two Labour MPs here today, and they were loud in singing the Prime Minister's praises, and both said he is the strongest man we have had since Pitt." There were attentive little courtesies, too. The King, as a colonel-in-chief of the Welsh Guards, refused even to consider their abolition as a post-war economy until he knew Lloyd George's opinion. The regiment was reprieved. Lloyd George was slow to recognize magnanimity, or indeed to find any virtue in his sovereign until long after he had ceased to be Prime Minister. In 1973, however, laughing heartily, he told this story to his secretary. One day during the peace conference, Clemenceau came in late, in a towering rage because he had been summoned to see the president, who was evidently bothering the old man a great deal. Clemenceau whispered in LG's ear, "Can't you lend me George V for a time?" The King was more generous in recognizing the achievements of Lloyd George. On the 29th of June, 1919, after months of arduous negotiation in Paris, the Prime Minister returned from signing the Treaty of Versailles. Abandoning protocol, the King met him at Victoria Station. On the drive back to Buckingham Palace, the crowds threw flowers into the carriage, and a laurel wreath fell on the King's knees. "This is for you," he said, and handed it to the peacemaker. And that is the end of that chapter, which is entitled Peace of Sorts. The next chapter is entitled The Irish Settlement, which is very, very interesting because that's when Ireland was voting for home rule. They had the Irish rebellions, and it's very interesting that chapter on the Irish settlement. So, and that is when Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland became a republic, and Northern Ireland ended up still remaining under the UK. And part of them were Protestant, part of them were Catholic, and very interesting. And then, of course, followed all the IRA uprisings and the Troubles, which is another important time period of the Irish history. So very interesting. King George V, he had quite a lot to deal with, and I just think he just carried on and did his duty. So it's very interesting. So thank you very much for listening, and you all have a nice day. I have a lot going on over the weekend. I'm helping my son move into his apartment, so I am going to try to read a little bit each day to finish this book, which can be found on thriftbook.com, and it is a fascinating read. But Audible has a lot of books on King George V, different authors. Amazon has some books on King George V. Go to your library, read about him. It's a fascinating read for a very dutiful king. So, and check out any YouTube documentary you can find on King George V, because I really like him. He's not perfect. He's not, no person is perfect, but I really like King George V. So, thank you very much for listening, and you all have a nice day.